During a My Dark Path research trip to Moscow in 2021, I had the opportunity to visit the Russian Academy of Sciences. It's a unique building with certain elements that are typical of an American university or government building. It has large rectangular spaces formed of granite. But atop this building is a massive, intricate copper-colored object. Sometimes it's called the building's golden crown, but the object appears to be an unusual radio antenna or some other technical mechanism designed for communication. As I researched the Academy of Sciences and the rumors about the purpose of this structure, I found a dark path into the Soviet pursuit of psychic powers that I'll explore here today.
The year is 1978. The place is Baguio City in the Philippines. The Cold War is at its height. The Soviet Union has begun a crackdown of dissidents. The U.S. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance assures skeptics that the Carter administration will hold the Soviet Union accountable for that suppression and violation of human rights. And within a year, Brezhnev will launch the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which in turn spawned the American boycott of the Moscow Olympics the following year. International competition was one place where the Soviet Union and the United States continued their Cold War rivalry while showing which nation produced the best athletes, the best sportsmen, and the best games of strategy and intellect. And in 1978 in the Philippines, the game was the World Chess Championships. The Soviet Union's hero, Anatoly Karpov, was a chess grandmaster and the 12th World Chess Champion from 1975 to 1985. In 1974, he had an upset victory over the former champion Boris Spassky, earning the right to face American chess legend Bobby Fischer. The governing board of chess, the International Chess Federation, declared that Fischer's conditions to play Karpov fell outside the bounds of allowable matches. Fischer forfeited his title and Karpov was declared the new world champion. In 1978, Karpov was defending his title again against the next best chess player in the world, fellow Soviet chess grandmaster Viktor Korchnoi. The difference between the two is that Karpov had the support of the Soviet government and Korchnoi was already the enemy. You see, back in 1974 when Karpov was ascending to the heights of Soviet chess, the Soviet Chess Federation announced that the generation that included Korchnoi had all been defeated by Bobby Fischer and thus could not compete successfully against him. Korchnoi was banned from playing chess outside the Soviet Union, so he defected in Amsterdam in 1976. The match in 1978 was thus a fight between the current world chess champion, Soviet Grandmaster Karpov, against Soviet defector and now Western champion Korchnoi. Korchnoi had embarrassed the Soviet Union by infecting, and so it was vitally important, in the eyes of the Soviet government, that Karpov win the match, and they decided to take no chances. In 1978, as the match begins, there is a man in the front row right by Korchnoi. He does not look at Karpov at all. He's not even watching the game. He simply stares at Korchnoi. What he is thinking is this: you must lose, and you should stop playing. And lastly, you are a traitor to the Soviet people. Korchnoi later reports that he can hear these thoughts in his own head, and at one moment he stopped the game, turned to the officials and shouts, "If you do not remove that man, I will remove him with my fists." The man simply sat and smiled, and the game continued. The man's name was Dr. Vladimir Zukar. He worked for the KGB as a psychic thought projector. And when the Soviet Union wanted damaging thoughts in people's heads, especially athletes or other competitors, Dr. Zukar was the one they sent. Zukar also allegedly had the ability to stop hearts from a distance using only thoughts. And by all accounts, he was able to stop frogs' hearts from beating in a lab. We do not know if he was successful against human beings, but the Soviets claimed he could stop a person's heart as well. But he was successful in disrupting play in Baguio City. Korchnoi's girlfriend took the seat next to Dr. Zukar and began kicking him to disrupt his thoughts. But Zukar never took his eyes off Korchnoi. Zukar used his psychic abilities to help demonstrate the superiority of the Soviet system. It did not matter if Karpov won on his own or not. Zukar was the insurance to guarantee that he would win, period. The dissident represented the failure of the West to defeat Soviet brainpower, both on the chessboard and in the global arena. And after losing the match, Korchnoi said, quote, "I expected to play against one. Instead, the whole Red Army, led by Zukar, was against me," end quote. The press reported that Karpov was aided by parapsychological warfare in a sports setting. Now, sports settings were just one of several places where the Soviets engaged in psychic experiments to see if, through the power of thought, the Soviets could defeat competitors in sports and games, spy on the Americans, and even assassinate at a distance.
Our dark path runs right through the laboratories where the Soviets created supermen and psychic spies. Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and this is My Dark Path, where I explore stories from the unexplained.
Popular culture has had a field day imagining what strange psychic experiments might have happened in the labs of the Soviet Union. The recent Netflix hit Stranger Things is rooted in the idea that during the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in experiments that created or enhanced special powers in individuals that would allow them to mentally enter the top secret locations of the other side, or affect the outcome of a contest or game, or even kill with mind bullets. The 1984 film Dreamscape imagines developing the psychic abilities of spies to enter into people's dreams and kill them. British horror writer Brian Lumley's 1986 novel Necroscope and its sequels imagined a James Bond-like series of psychic espionage contests between British E-branch and the Soviet E-branch, E being short for extrasensory perception. And this resulted in the British needing psychics to help fight the Soviet psychic vampires. More recently, the book and film The Men Who Stare at Goats detailed the experiments carried out by the CIA to do the same things, learn Saddam Hussein's plans by telepathy, change the behavior of soldiers, and, as the title suggests, stare at goats until you can stop their hearts with a thought. Truth, as they say, is even stranger than fiction. No vampires will be discussed today, but instead we will consider the Soviet experiments in psychic spying and the development of superhuman athletes. It's kind of strange when you think of it. The purpose of all the time, money, and effort in these programs in the United States and the Soviet Union were for psychic espionage, finding military advantages through the power of thought, and for making better athletes, and, failing the latter, making individuals who could mentally destroy the opponents of those athletes. Dr. Vladimir Zukar was not a chess master, but he was instrumental in Karpov's victory in the Philippines in 1978. From its origins during the First World War, the Soviet Union was looking for any advantage to aid the spread of Soviet socialism and advance the cause of global communism. In a sense, they were fighting a Cold War against the capitalistic West even before the Second World War. Soviet leaders were interested in the scientific approach to unusual phenomenon for the purposes of using those phenomenon to advance the cause of global communism. The Soviets took unexplained occurrences and abilities such as ESP and precognition much more seriously than their counterparts in the West, at least at first. One of the fastest ways to get funding for a project in the United States during the Cold War was to assert that the Soviets were ahead of us in that area, no matter how ridiculous that area may seem. The US did not want the USSR to have an advantage because of psychic powers, and thus did not care if said powers were real or not, only that we matched what the Soviets were doing. Beginning in the early 1920s, a program was established at the Institute for Brain Research at Leningrad State University for the study of telepathy. The Soviets wanted to use mind reading and thought transference. They referred to telepathy as biological communication and sought to use it for ship-to-shore communication, contacting submarines and giving direction at great distances. Eventually, later on, the Institute considered training cosmonauts to develop their precognitive abilities, or the ability to see the future, to foresee and avoid accidents in space. They also conducted experiments in contacting submarines via telepathy. This experimentation was also used to locate American submarines. The initial experiments were not just limited to investigations into telepathy. These early Soviets also researched psychokinesis, the ability to move objects with the mind. From affecting athletic contests to using psychokinesis, also called PK, to sabotage military equipment, the Soviets worked non-stop to use mind power to affect the physical world at a distance. By the 1960s, that research was being used to explore the possibility of Soviet psychics disrupting the electrical systems of intercontinental ballistic missiles, allowing Soviets to destroy or change the flight path of American nuclear weapons. Soviet scientists believe that paranormal abilities are the result of bioenergetics, the energy given off by the metabolic processes of all living things. They theorized that people exude bioplasma, a charged energy field that was capable of emitting radiation beyond the body in the form of electrons and protons. People who learn to direct their bioenergy and control their bioplasma can display phenomena such as ESP, telekinesis, psychokinesis, mind reading, and physical feats not possible by the ordinary human.
Learning to control bioplasma and brainwaves would, according to Soviet scientists, lead to advantages in sports, espionage, military conflict, and international relations. But the Soviets did not constrain themselves just to bioplasma, telekinesis, and telepathy. Instead, they embraced and explored every area of paranormal phenomenon scientifically in order to gain an advantage. Soviet geologists used dowsing rods in the Baltics. In the Ural Mountains, scientists practiced eyeless sight. A lab in the Black Sea was tasked with studying psychic healing, and the Soviets studied clairvoyance and past life regression.
Writer Ed Hawkins noted that during the Cold War, America and the Soviet Union held a common belief. They believed that superhumans, a race of beings that could slow time, see across continents into locked rooms, levitate, predict the future, kill with the mind, and change body shapes. They believed that they could put thoughts in people's heads or even stop the heart of another human being by staring at them. Both nations put this belief system to work in the service of two tasks: espionage and the creation of better athletes. And you heard me correctly, part of the program of both the United States and the Soviet Union investigating psychic ability and what we consider to be real-world superpowers was the desire to create superhuman sports stars that could dominate at the Olympics and other world-class events, showcasing, therefore, the superiority of their nation and ideology. The CIA and KGB were both in the business of creating assassins and weightlifters. The Russian term for developing these abilities is hidden human reserves. By the 1950s, the Soviets were pioneering at least 3 types of psychic phenomenon with which to assist Soviet athletes. The first, as already mentioned, were people like Dr. Zucker who helped get in the minds of opponents to make them lose. The second were those who would work to improve Soviet athletes' performances through mind power, and the third were the athletes themselves. The Soviets referred to it as psychic self-regulation, athletes controlling their bodies, their breathing, and the performances through mind power. Much of what they discovered is actually still applied internationally to sports today. Everything from meditation before a competition to golfers visualizing the ball going into the hole before taking the shot. But this was innovative stuff back in the 50s. By the 1970s, the Soviets had coined the term the theory of top competition in sports, reflecting research done at the All-Union Research Institute of Physical Culture in Moscow. In addition to training techniques and steroid use, the Soviets wanted to use mind power to win competitions and continued to have a large number of scientists working on it. Using yoga, long before it had become popular as it is now, as well as meditation and other Eastern mystic techniques. Soviet scientists studied what they termed psychic self-regulation. They developed techniques still in use today of visualization, breathing, and focus. Athletes were taught extensive visualization techniques, picturing themselves doing something before they actually did it, imagining lifting a weight or hitting a golf ball. These techniques are still employed in sports around the world. Tiger Woods has discussed at length his use of visualization as a part of his golf game. It's what he calls putting to the picture. Quote, "Every look I take from the ball is a picture, so I take the picture of what is right there, one. At my second look, I take another picture. I get up over the ball. I take the last picture, and all I do is think about putting to the picture. All I am doing is putting to the picture. I'm telling you, down the stretch in tournaments when I'm really nervous, I will go back to that and say, 'Come on, Tiger, just putt to the picture,' like Papa used to say," end quote. This technique was pioneered by golf great Jack Nicklaus and was developed out of work done by Soviet and American scientists making athletic supermen. Soviet scientists would have athletes practice focusing and breathing while playing loud crowd noises to teach them to ignore the noisy distractions and focus on the task at hand. Through psychic self-regulation, athletes could eradicate pain or tension, control their heart rate, blood flow, and even body temperature, and focus exclusively on the athletic activity regardless of what else was happening around them. Scientists recorded that the use of these techniques considerably enhanced the performances of the athletes who were taught and then practiced them. The same scientists also consulted with so-called Siberian witches to learn psychic healing techniques. Dr. Alexander Krivoritov would place patients in a chair, place his hands over the diseased or wounded area, and heal the patient much faster than normal. His patients reported feeling tremendous heat coming from his hands. The Soviets especially wanted to apply these techniques to the rapid healing of athletes from their sports injuries. So not only did the Soviets have psychics in the stands to help them win, they also had psychic healers on the sidelines and athletes who employed esoteric psychic practice, visualization, and psychic self-regulation to win over the athletes from the decadent West who, tangentially, were doing the same things. Oddly, in the 1970s, Soviet and American scientists working on developing psychic powers began to communicate with each other, more interested in data sharing than ideology. In his fascinating book, The Men on Magic Carpets, Ed Hawkins extensively interviews Jim Hickman and Mike Murphy. They were a part of a group of athletic trainers who were also New Age thinkers. They were men who thought that by exploiting the Eastern mysticism and psychic phenomenon that were making their way through the counterculture, that they could also improve athletes' performances. In the 70s and 80s, they worked with a variety of athletes, but also met with their Soviet counterparts. Mike and Jim wanted athletes to develop their occult subtle energy so that basketball players could use levitation to help with their shots, and golfers could use their minds to direct the ball to the cup.
In this concept of occult subtle energy, the Soviets saw the idea of their own bioplasma. At a conference of sports science in 1980, one that coincided with the 1980 Olympics, Soviet and American scientists started to meet regularly to pursue better, stronger athletes. But behind all of this collaboration, of course, was funding from the American and Soviet governments who wanted superior athletes gaining victories for their side, but they also were interested in the military and espionage applications of the quest for the Superman through the supernatural. The Soviets also became interested in distance mind control. Special Department 8 was founded to carry out all kinds of psychic experiments. As one of 40 divisions housed at Science City, Novosibirsk in southwest Siberia, the psychic scientists and their families were a part of a large community of individuals carrying out experiments to advance science and technology in the Soviet Union. It is said the average age in Science City was 30 and the average IQ well over 130.
Whereas other departments were engaging in chemistry, physics, biology, and technological research, Special Department 8 was doing the weird stuff, exploring how the brain interacted with events from a great distance away. For example, one experiment involved implanting electrodes in a mother rabbit's brain and then taking her litter to a submarine that went to the depths of the Pacific. And then, while this is hard stuff to hear, they would kill the baby rabbits one at a time. Scientists back in Novosibirsk then recorded the reactions in the mother rabbit's brain, synchronized to the second of each of her baby's deaths. They reported that at each moment of death, her brain somehow knew and reacted. Successes such as this encouraged the Soviet government to invest fully in psychic experiments. By 1967, it is estimated that there were an additional 20 research centers across the Soviet Union performing experiments, with a total budget of 20 million rubles, or about $21 million at the time. The Kremlin committed to the experiments because they wanted to develop superhumans. Not only did they commit the money, they also committed to finding citizens who had the powers that could be further developed. They conducted a nationwide search for anyone who displayed any potential for ESP or mind powers. One such person was Nina Kolagnia, who did allegedly prove that she could move objects with her mind. Scientists would place objects inside glass fish tanks so that they could not be manipulated by air currents or by other means, and Nina would stare at them until they began to move. She could stop a frog's heart, although doing so would raise her own heart rate to 240 beats a minute. Nelia Mikhailova grew up in Leningrad. She was born a decade after the revolution that overthrew the Tsar and was 14 when the Nazis invaded Russia. Like many Russian teens, she joined the army and fought the Nazis, finally withdrawing from combat after being seriously injured by artillery fire. Years after the war, she came to the attention of Soviet scientists because it became apparent that Nelia had powers. Her pulse could also race as high as 250 beats per minute when she focused. In this state, she could make the needle of a compass spin, open and scatter a box of matches, and move pens, cigarettes, and other small objects around a tabletop from a distance, all by using her mind. It came out later that she had had this ability as a child. As a baby, she could draw toys to herself from across the floor or make a desired food move across a table. She was thoroughly investigated, tested under the most rigorous conditions, and examined by scientists who wanted to understand how she did it, and furthermore, if people could be trained to do it, albeit now in service of the Soviet Union. In another experiment on April 19, 1966, famous journalist and actor Karl Nikolaev flew from Moscow to Science City, Novosibirsk, to take part in the Grand Moscow-Siberia Telepathy event. Back in Moscow, at the designated time, biophysicist Yuri Kamensky was presented with a sealed package and ushered into an isolated, insulated chamber. The plan was for Kamensky to examine 6 objects for 10 minutes each and attempt to project an image of each to Nikolaev, who would attempt to receive these thoughts and describe what he was receiving. The first object was a metal spring consisting of 7 tight coils. Round, metallic, gleaming, looks like a coil, Nikolaev noted. Kamensky focused on a screwdriver with a black plastic handle. Nikolaev saw long and thin, metal, plastic, black plastic. Over the next 2 weeks, Nikolaev attempted to receive thoughts from 4 different senders. Nikolaev identified a barbell visualized by one. Some people were more effective at sending thoughts than others, thus confirming a Soviet theory that a trained sender is almost as important as a gifted receiver. If the sender is unfocused or sends unclear images, the receiver gets equally indistinct images. What made all this ironic is that even though the Soviet science community was open to the possibility of telepathy, psychokinesis, and precognition, and the Soviet intelligence community was happy to experiment with it to gain an advantage in the Cold War, the official position of the Soviet Union was that parapsychology was a decadent Western fraud that went against Soviet principles. The 1956 edition of the official Soviet encyclopedia observed, quote, "Telepathy is an antisocial, idealistic fiction about humanity's supernatural power to perceive phenomenon which, considering the time and space, cannot be perceived." End quote. Paranormal phenomenon directly contradicted the theories of Marxist-Leninist philosophy. Psychic phenomenon cannot exist, argued Soviet physical scientists, and Soviet scientific principles treated it as a superstition, referring to it as bourgeois fiction. Yet, the experiments in this antisocial, idealistic fiction, as it had been called, had been continuing for decades, arguably somewhat successfully. The Soviets would simply mask it under other names. In 1965, the Popov Group, which was a short name for the Bioinformation Section of the A.S. Popov All-Union Scientific Technical Society for Radio Technology and Electrical Communications, they decided to focus on bioinformation communication, the Soviet euphemism for ESP and telepathy. They made Nikolaev their resident lab rat after the Siberia experiment and studied how he could transmit and receive information, which led to their next great experiment. In March of 1967, the Popov Group flashed a coded message via telepathy from Moscow to Leningrad. Once again, Yuri Kaminsky sat in Moscow while Nikolaev sat in a lab at the University of Leningrad. The scientists attached him to an electroencephalograph, better known as an EEG machine, to measure his brainwaves. This time, Nikolov had no idea what time or how many or what type of telepathic message would be sent. According to the scientists, 3 seconds after Kaminsky started transmitting, Nikolov's brain lit up. They said his brain waves changed dramatically, causing the scientists to believe that they had caught the moment of telepathy. As Kaminsky focused on an empty cigarette box in Moscow, the visual centers of Nikolov's brain lit up, and he described, quote, "something that looks like cigarettes. It is the lid, inside is empty. The surface is cold, it is cardboard," end quote. When Kaminsky spoke out loud in Moscow, the areas of the temporal section of Nikolov's brain associated with sound and hearing registered longer brain waves. The Soviets believed they had proven the reality of telepathy and that it could possibly be controlled and directed, which meant that it could be used to strategic advantage. And on the other side of the globe, the CIA was funding and carrying out very similar experiments. The Cold War had become a psychic war as well. Fearing the Americans might be more successful in developing psychic powers, the Soviets doubled down. Yuri Andropov, who was the leader of the Soviet Union from 1982 to 1984, served as the head of the KGB from 1967 to 1982. One of his mandates was that the Soviet Union must lead the world in psychic research and its practical applications. He wanted psychic spies and people who could use mental powers to change the world. Human life was irrelevant. Test subjects to experiment on could be very easily had. Rats could have their skulls opened, electrodes attached, and the psychics would attempt to communicate with their brains and make them feel specific emotions and sensations. But it was only a matter of time when the subjects moved from rats to human beings. The morally questionable experiments resulted in at least one lab being shut down by scientists who refused to continue the experiments. Instead, Andropov replaced them with a secret mega lab built in a sub-basement under the Filatov Eye Institute in Odessa. Death row inmates were brought to the lab and placed in cells. The scientists bombarded them with pulsing magnetic fields to see if they could become clairvoyant. Instead, their brains simply melted. In 1972, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency published a classified 174-page report entitled Controlled Offensive Behavior, USSR. It warned that the same experiments the Soviets were doing with their athletes were also being done with their agents. The report warned the KGB was training its spies to have psycho-energetic abilities, whatever that means. In response, the CIA began experimenting to develop American psychic spies. At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, CIA scientists would show a picture of a place and then ask the psychic being tested to describe what was occurring in the area. The Soviets had been doing this for years. The CIA's program was called Project Stargate and was moved later to the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, where they were discovering and training psychic warriors to go toe-to-toe with the Soviet psychic spies. The most famous of these is Uri Geller, better known now as an entertaining and spoon-bending clairvoyant who claims to have psychokinesis among his abilities. The CIA would have Geller and the others sit in the office at Menlo Park, focus on locations in the Soviet Union, and then draw the location of Soviet missiles. Sometimes they were right. The CIA psychic spies held themselves as superior to the Soviets as the Americans refused to attempt to kill using psychic powers. That may or may not be true, but the Soviets had no such compunction about attempting psychic assassination. The KGB created an exact replica of the Oval Office, placing psychics in it around the clock, 24 hours a day on short shifts, focusing on the American president, attempting to first confuse and bewilder him. Later on, psychics would see if they could stop the president's heart from the Soviet Union using only the power of thought. In 2021, the CIA declassified a number of memos related to Project Stargate and the Soviet hidden human reserves, one of which details how CIA agents were tracking 2 Soviet scientists in 1991 who'd been conducting experiments on ESP for the purpose of gaining information and influencing people from a great distance. The declassified memo reports that the Soviet scientist Konstantin Bujenko was described as having perfected his method of ESP by conducting experiments in which he would put a volunteer patient in the middle of a room that had 2 concave mirrors on opposite sides. The document noted the researchers believed that, quote, the mirrors focused psychic energy, end quote. A medical psychic would then concentrate on transmitting his psychic energy to the patient while simultaneously empathetically experience the patient's discomfort and pain. The psychic would then transmit bioplasma to the patient, attempting to control or cure whatever disease affected the patient. They experimented on everything from asthma to heart disease to cancer. In 1987 and 1998 alone, about 3,000 patients underwent what the Soviets called non-traditional medical treatment, including the use of psychic methods. The other scientist the CIA had been tracking was Vail Khaznachev, described in the CIA memo as a well-known authority on ESP. He conducted experiments in which volunteers attempted to relay to one another images of geometric shapes, such as squares or circles. Yet another scientist that had been studied by the CIA, according to the declassified memos, was Dr. Igor Smirnov of the Institute of Psychocorrection.
He was hired by the Soviet government in the early 80s to blast silent sounds into the minds of people, or in other words, attempting to influence people from a distance without them ever knowing what he was doing. His first task was to blast silent messages at Red Army troops being sent to combat in Afghanistan in the early 80s. The message he blasted to the minds of these soldiers was, quote, "Don't get drunk before battle," end quote. Soviet experiments to understand the world through methods other than standard scientific approaches reached into all other areas of human endeavors. In Krasnodar in 1939, anyone who wanted their scientific equipment repaired was sent to Semyon Daljevich Kirlian, regarded by all as the best electrician in the Kubar region, which was near the Black Sea. While repairing an instrument used for medical electrotherapy, Kirlian saw a tiny flash between electrode and skin and began wondering what would happen if he put a photographer's plate between the electrode and the skin. What kind of photo might emerge? So he attached a metal electrode to his own skin and, placing the photographic plate, switched on the current. Although he gave himself a severe burn, he chalked it up to a sacrifice for science and developed the plate. The photo showed the silhouette of his hand with luminescence surrounding the fingers, like thousands of tiny flares were leaping off of his hand into the surrounding air. He began to work on taking such photos without the pain or burning and discovered this luminescence surrounds all living things in such photos.
He called it a window on the unknown, and this type of picture now bears his name, Kirlian photography. There are examples of it on our website. The pictures are fascinating, dynamic energy patterns surrounding leaves, hands, a piece of fruit. Any organic thing photographed in this manner displays an aura. Soon, the elite of Soviet science were making their way to Kirlian's lab to see his photos. One brought 2 leaves torn from the same species of tree at the same moment. They were identical in every way. Kirlian and his wife photographed them, and their auras were different, which was not the expected result. Kirlian had theorized each species of plant had its own frequency of aura, and 2 leaves from the same type of tree should be similar. Dr. and Mrs. Kirlian stayed up all night trying to make the leaves photograph the same, but could not. When the scientist returned the next morning, he was delighted, explaining that they were from the same type of tree, one of which had a fatal plant disease. With no external indication of the illness, the leaves clearly showed the presence of a debilitating aspect to the tree in the Kirlian photographs. This result was repeated when Kirlian attempted to demonstrate photos of his own hand, which did not show the expected aura, but rather something blurry and dim. And that evening, he fell very ill. Kirlian photography could indicate illness before it was actually experienced in animals and plants. For centuries, mediums had claimed to be able to see an aura surrounding people, and Kirlian simply photographed it. The Kirlians worked for a quarter century on their technique, and the Soviet ministries of health and agriculture also supported their research, thinking that it may help disease diagnosis and stronger crops. Photos of dead bodies showed no such aura. A photo of a leaf torn in half shows luminescence where the missing part was. Ultimately, the State University of Kazakhstan determined that the Kirlians had photographed bioplasma, the substance the scientists in the 1920s had theorized was extruded by all living bodies. In the West, such photographs were considered a novelty, and in the Soviet Union, they justified the hidden human reserve program by confirming the existence of bioplasma and its absence when a body dies. Kirlian photography could also be used to mark and track individuals who strengthened their bioplasma. As I mentioned earlier, fascinatingly, and unlike most espionage, the Soviets and the Americans often spoke with each other about their attempts to use psychic powers to improve sports. The Americans and Soviets working on human potential communicated quite regularly, sharing some information about their experiments and learning from one another. Jim Hickman, a figure that I mentioned earlier and key in American psychic research during the Cold War, actually spent much of the 70s and 80s traveling in the USSR to research Soviet hidden human potential experiments. Hickman now tells that during those visits he learned about strange, disturbing projects. Some even stranger and more disturbing than a whole bunch of Dr. Zukars trying to influence the thought patterns of a head of state from a great distance. He said, quote, "There was much deeper work going on. We knew that we were only talking to the people they let us talk to," end quote. Similarly, the CIA would speak with and keep careful tabs on any American scientist visiting or exchanging information with their Soviet counterparts. Perhaps the most disturbing use of psychic experiments in the Soviet Union was a project by physiologist Dr. Leonid L. Vasiliev. As much as the Americans feared what Soviet psychics might be able to do in the Cold War, the fact is that many experiments were to the detriment of Soviet citizens. In the 60s, Vasiliev experimented with telepathy and mind control as a form of population control and brainwashing in order to indoctrinate and then re-educate what Soviets called antisocial elements, a term that covered everyone from criminals to those who spoke ill of Stalin or were not patriotic enough. Psychics would attempt to enter their minds and induce them to adopt the correct political and social attitudes. These experiments were highly secret, as they would constitute evidence that there were those who lived under socialism but did not care for it, a fact that the communists did not like to disclose. And it's a useful reminder that the scientists carrying out all these experiments discussed today may have been men and women of science genuinely seeking to explore and unlock human potential, but they were also pawns of the politicians, the KGB, and the Soviet military. The government saw to it that the Soviet scientists were provided everything published in the West on psychic phenomenon, and even many things that were not published, and then worked to ensure only that which the government approved of being released to the West ever found its way out of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, the Soviet experiments in hidden human reserves in athletics and espionage were for the same purpose, creating a race of Soviet superhumans to win the Cold War, whether on the chessboard, the Olympic Stadium, or in the espionage game. And in fairness, the CIA in the United States was doing exactly the same thing.
If you enjoyed today's episode, I recommend Ed Hawkins' book, The Men on Magic Carpets, Searching for the Superhuman Sports Star, as it tells the tale of American attempts to use psychic powers, meditation, and other New Age techniques to create superhuman sports stars, as well as develop a team of American psychic spies who would be the equivalent of the Soviet ones that I've discussed today. Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder's 1970 book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, is also a fascinating study of Soviet engagement with parapsychology, and equally fascinating in hindsight, based on what we know now that the Soviet Union is no more. Thank you for joining me in this episode of My Dark Path. I'm MF Thomas, the creator and host. If you've made it this far and enjoyed the content, please like this video and enjoy another one from our channel. Again, thanks for walking the dark paths of the world with me. Until next time, good night.